The clinking of silver against porcelain was the only sound Julian Croft tolerated from his wife in public. Tonight at Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive its name was whispered rather than spoken, even that small noise grated on his nerves. He sat opposite Ilara, his wife of 3 years, and saw not a partner, but a liability. Her dress was a simple, elegant navy blue, but on her it looked plain. Her hair was gathered in a neat, unremarkable chignon. She was a beige wall in a room that demanded to be a masterpiece. Across the table, Alistair Finch, a man whose portfolio was as thick as his jowls, swirled a blood-red vintage in his glass. Julian needed Finch's signature on the Sterling Tower project. It was a deal that would catapult him from the city's financial pages to its legends. "The projections are conservative, Alistair," Julian said, his voice a smooth, confident purr. "We're not just building a skyscraper, we're erecting a monument to future commerce. The ground floor retail alone will recoup 20% of the initial investment within 3 years." Finch grunted, non-committal. His gaze drifted past Julian to Ilara. "Your wife is a quiet one, Julian." Julian's smile tightened. "Ilara is a more traditionalist. She believes a woman's place is in the home, not the boardroom." He gave her a look that was meant to be a fond pat on the head, but felt like a slap. "Isn't that right, darling?" Ilara looked up from her plate, her grey eyes holding a stillness that Julian mistook for vapidity. "I believe a person's place is where they are most effective," she said, her voice soft but clear. Finch raised an eyebrow. "An interesting distinction. And where are you most effective, Mrs. Croft?" Before Ilara could answer, Julian cut in with a hearty laugh. "At making my life comfortable, of course. She runs a seamless household. An absolute artist when it comes to domestic management." He was selling her like a high-end appliance. He turned back to his pitch, painting a grand vision of glass and steel, of profit margins and market dominance. He spoke of risk mitigation and leveraging assets, his words a symphony of corporate jargon. Alistair Finch seemed to be warming up, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with the avarice Julian knew so well. "The key is our diversified debt structuring," Julian continued, reaching the crescendo of his argument. "We've secured preliminary agreements with 3 major lenders, ensuring we're not overexposed with any single institution. It's a fortress." Finch nodded slowly. "Impressive. But what about sovereign wealth volatility? The instability in the East Asian markets could tighten lending globally overnight." It was a standard, predictable question, and Julian had a polished answer ready. But before he could deliver it, Ilara spoke again, her voice still quiet, yet it cut through the restaurant's murmur. "The instability is a manufactured narrative," she said simply. Julian froze. Alistair Finch turned his full attention to her. "I beg your pardon." Ilara looked at Finch, not Julian. "The Nikkei's dip is a temporary market correction orchestrated by Ethelred Holdings to facilitate a low-cost acquisition of the Yoshimura Tech portfolio. The capital won't tighten, it will be rerouted. The smart money will follow Ethelred, not flee from the headlines. The Sterling Tower project should be financed through them, not a consortium of banks who will panic." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's face, a moment ago flushed with triumphant salesmanship, was now a mask of cold fury. Ethelred Holdings? It was a ghost, a myth in the financial world. A shadowy private equity firm rumored to control more assets than most small nations, but no one knew who ran it. For his plain, simple wife to speak its name with such authority was not just embarrassing, it was absurd. She had read an article, a blog post, and was now parroting it like an expert, undermining his entire presentation. Alistair Finch stared at Ilara, a strange, calculating look in his eyes. "That's a very specific analysis, Mrs. Croft. Where did you come across that theory?" "I just observe patterns," Ilara replied, taking a delicate sip of water. Julian saw his deal, his monument, his legacy, crumbling into dust. Finch was looking at him now, a hint of suspicion in his eyes, as if Julian had been hiding a secret partner. The image of control he had so carefully cultivated was shattered, and it was shattered by her. A dark, hot rage coiled in his stomach. He had told her to be quiet. He had told her to smile and nod. He had told her to be invisible. "Darling," Julian said, his voice dangerously low. "You're speaking out of turn. You know nothing of these matters." "I apologize if I misspoke," Ilara said, her gaze returning to her plate. But the damage was done. The spell was broken. Finch was leaning back, his interest cooled. All Julian could see was Ilara's calm, placid face, the source of his public humiliation. He saw 3 years of putting up with her silence, her lack of ambition, her utter failure to be the dazzling socialite his career demanded. She was a weight, and tonight she had finally dragged him under. He picked up his glass of Chateau Margaux, the wine a deep, staining crimson. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury, "are a fool." And with a flick of his wrist, he threw the entire contents of the glass at her. The red wine arced through the candlelit air and crashed against her, splashing across her face, her neck, and down the front of her simple navy dress. It looked like blood. Gasps rippled through the restaurant, forks and knives froze mid-air. Every eye in Aurelia was on their table. Ilara didn't flinch, she didn't cry out. She simply sat there, motionless, as the dark liquid dripped from her chin onto the pristine white tablecloth, each drop landing with an unnaturally loud pat. The silence in Aurelia was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Julian's chest heaved, the adrenaline of his rage giving way to a cold, satisfying sense of dominance. He had put her back in her place. He had reasserted control. He glanced at Alistair Finch, expecting a look of male camaraderie, an understanding nod. Instead, Finch looked utterly appalled, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disgust. Ilara slowly raised a hand, not to wipe her face, but to gently touch the drenched fabric of her dress. The wine had soaked through, cold against her skin. She didn't look at Julian. Her gaze was distant, as if she were calculating a complex equation. There were no tears, no trembling lip, no sign of the humiliation he had intended to inflict. There was only a profound, unsettling stillness. A young waitress, whose name tag read Chloe, rushed forward, her hands fluttering with a stack of linen napkins. "Ma'am, are you all right? Let me help you." Before Chloe could reach her, Ilara raised her hand slightly, a gesture that was not imperious, but held an undeniable authority. The waitress stopped instantly. "Thank you, Chloe," Ilara said, her voice even. "But that won't be necessary." She knew the waitress's name. Julian frowned. Had she even spoken to the staff? The restaurant manager, a portly man named Mr. Dubois, with a perpetually worried expression, scurried over. "Mr. Croft, is everything all right?" His eyes darted from Julian's furious face to Ilara's wine-soaked form, and he made a swift, sycophantic calculation. Julian was the regular, the big spender. "My wife had a dizzy spell, a clumsy accident," Julian lied smoothly, already spinning the narrative. "We'll handle the cleaning bill, of course." Mr. Dubois nodded eagerly, relieved to have a palatable explanation. "Of course, sir. No trouble at all." He turned to Ilara. "Madame, perhaps you'd like to use the powder room to freshen up." Ilara finally moved. She stood up, her posture perfect. The wine had stained her dress in a ghastly pattern, yet she wore the ruin of it like a royal mantle. "No," she said calmly, "I will not be freshening up, but I will be settling the bill, for the meal, the wine, and for the damages to the tablecloth and my dress. Please, bring me the check for the entire evening." Julian scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Ilara. I'll take care of it." "You don't have any money." Her allowance was a paltry sum he controlled, just enough for groceries and the occasional bland shopping trip. The idea of her paying a bill that would likely run into the thousands was laughable. "Nevertheless," Ilara insisted, her eyes fixed on the manager, "I will be paying." Mr. Dubois looked helplessly at Julian, who gave a dismissive wave. "Fine, let her try. Her card will be declined. It will be the final lesson of the evening." A new character entered the tableau. From a discreet corner table, a man who had been observing the entire scene rose to his feet. He was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored grey suit, his demeanour utterly unremarkable, which in itself made him stand out. He was of average height and build, with thinning hair and plain glasses, but he moved with an unnerving economy of motion. He approached the table not with a guard's aggression, but with the quiet purpose of a butler. He stopped a respectful few feet from Ilara. "Is everything in order, madame?" he asked, his voice low and toneless. Julian bristled. "Who the hell are you? This is a private matter." The man ignored Julian completely, his attention solely on Ilara. "Everything is under control, Arthur," Ilara replied. "I am simply concluding my business here." Arthur. The name pricked at Julian's memory. It was the name of her charity foundation's administrator, the man he'd spoken to on the phone once or twice, who had always sounded like a meek accountant. This man was no accountant. Mr. Dubois returned, holding a leather billfold. He looked deeply uncomfortable. "Madame, the total is quite substantial." "I'm aware," Ilara said. She walked past Julian, past the horrified stares of the other diners, toward the reception desk where the restaurant's new payment terminal stood. It was a sleek black monolith, a recent installation from a company called Ethelred Security. Julian had sneered at it when he'd first seen it, another piece of ostentatious tech for the new money crowd. It boasted military-grade encryption and biometric verification for its highest-tier members. "You'll need to use the card reader, madame," Mr. Dubois said nervously. "The facial scanner is for Ethelred Omega members only." Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. Omega members? How pretentious. "Just let her tap her little debit card so it can be declined and we can get on with our lives." Ilara paid him no mind. She stood before the black terminal. "The facial scanner will be fine," she said. The manager began to sweat. "But madame, it won't work. It requires a registered biometric signature. It's a closed system." "I am aware of how it works," Ilara said, her voice holding the first hint of impatience. She looked directly into the scanner's camera lens. A soft blue light bathed her face, tracing the contours of her features, ignoring the crimson stains of the wine. Julian folded his arms, a smirk playing on his lips. This was the peak of absurdity, the final pathetic act in his wife's delusional drama. He imagined the harsh red light, the access denied message, the final humiliation that would cement his victory tonight. Alistair Finch watched, rapt. The man named Arthur stood impassively behind Ilara, his hands clasped behind his back. The blue light blinked once, twice. The machine was silent. For a second, Julian's smirk widened. It had failed, just as he knew it would. Then a soft chime echoed through the silent restaurant. The terminal's screen, which had been black, flashed a brilliant emerald green. The green light from the terminal cast an eerie glow on Ilara's face. Julian's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. It must be an error. A system malfunction. He took a step closer, squinting at the screen, expecting to see a transaction receipt or an error code. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. There was no name, no account number, no transaction amount. Instead, in the center of the screen was a stark, stylized emblem of a raven with its wings unfurled. Beneath the emblem, in crisp white lettering, were 2 lines of text that seemed to burn into Julian's retinas. Identity, verified, owner, Ethelred. Access level, Omega. A collective gasp went through the staff who could see the screen. Mr. Dubois' face turned the color of ash. He stared at the terminal, then at the wine-stained woman before him, his jaw slack with disbelief and terror. But it was Alistair Finch's reaction that truly terrified Julian. The portly investor, a man who prided himself on his poker face, let out a choked gasp. He stumbled back from the table, knocking over his chair with a loud clatter that echoed the sound of Julian's world collapsing. "The Raven of Ethelred," Finch whispered, his voice trembling with a level of fear Julian had never heard from any man. It's you?" Ilara turned away from the terminal, her calm, grey eyes landing on Finch. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Finch looked as if he'd seen a deity. He began babbling, his words tripping over each other. "Madame, I had no idea. Please, my apologies, my deepest, most sincere apologies for my presence here tonight. For my ignorance. Julian was reeling. "What is going on? What is Ethelred?" "Ilara, what is this nonsense?" he demanded, his voice shrill with panic. The man Arthur finally moved. He stepped forward and placed a gentle but firm hand on Julian's shoulder. "I suggest you remain silent now, Mr. Croft." The touch was light, but it carried an undeniable weight of menace. Arthur then spoke into a discreet communications device in his cufflink. The Raven is compromised. Aurelia, execute protocol Gamma 7. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Mr. Dubois' personal tablet, sitting on the reception desk, chimed. He looked at it, and his face crumpled in despair. My employment, he stammered. Has been terminated, Arthur finished, without a flicker of emotion. As has the employment of every staff member currently on this floor. A severance package commensurate with your silence has already been wired to your accounts. A quiet panic began to ripple through the staff as phones chimed in unison. The head chef emerged from the kitchen, his face white. Our supplier contracts. They've all been cancelled. The restaurant's lease. The building is now the property of Ethelred Holdings, Arthur stated flatly. You all have 10 minutes to vacate the premises. It was a corporate execution, carried out with the speed and precision of a military strike. Julian watched, his mind unable to process the sheer scale of power on display. This wasn't business. This was a godlike force, and the epicenter of it all was his wife. His quiet, boring, simple wife. He turned to her, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. The odd phone calls she took in her study, always ending when he entered. The charity trips to Zurich, Geneva, and Singapore. Her uncanny ability to predict market shifts, which he had always dismissed as lucky guesses from reading the financial news. The time he'd been struggling with a complex derivatives problem for the Sterling Tower project, and he'd found a handwritten note on his desk the next morning with an elegant, brutally simple solution. A note he'd assumed was from one of his junior analysts. Elara. Who are you? He whispered, the question laced with a dawning, sickening dread. She finally looked at him, and for the first time in their 3 years of marriage, he saw what was truly behind her grey eyes. It wasn't emptiness. It was a vast, cold, calculating intelligence, an abyss of power so deep it made his own ambitions look like a child's sandcastle. My name, she said, her voice now devoid of its former softness, resonating with an authority that chilled him to the bone, is Elara Vance. Vance. The name echoed in the deepest recesses of his financial knowledge. Silas Vance, the legendary reclusive founder of Ethelred Holdings. A man who had vanished from public life 2 decades ago, presumed dead by many, but whose ghost was said to still pull the strings of the global economy. A man with no known heirs. Alistair Finch, who had been scrambling to pick up his chair, froze again. Vance, as in Silas Vance's... He was my guardian, Elara said, her gaze sweeping over the now emptying restaurant. And I am his successor. The revelation hit Julian like a physical blow. He wasn't married to Elara Croft, the mousy housewife. He was married to Elara Vance, the owner of Ethelred, the secret queen of the financial world, the single most powerful person he had ever met, or could ever conceive of meeting. And he had just thrown a glass of wine in her face. He looked at his hand, the one that had held the glass, and it was trembling uncontrollably. The wine on her dress wasn't just a stain, it was a mark of his own execution. He had not just insulted his wife, he had declared war on a god. Guardian. Successor. Julian stammered, his mind desperately trying to build a bridge between 2 impossible realities. This is a joke, a prank. You hired these people, didn't you? This is some elaborate sick joke to get back at me. Elara's expression didn't change. It was the calm, dispassionate look of a scientist observing a failed experiment. There is no joke, Julian, she said, only a conclusion. Arthur stepped forward, holding a sleek silver tablet. He handed it to Julian. On the screen was the homepage for the Croft Development Group's internal server. His company, his life's work. Look at your funding history, Elara commanded. With trembling fingers, Julian navigated to the financial archives. He scrolled through the major capital infusions that had allowed his rapid expansion over the past 3 years. The seed money for the Kensington project. The emergency line of credit that had saved him during the 2022 downturn. The massive investment that had made the Sterling Tower project possible. They were all listed as coming from a series of obscure, foreign-registered shell corporations. Viridian Capital, North Star Investments, the Argent Group. Arthur tapped a single icon at the bottom of the screen. a corporate flowchart bloomed into view, a dizzying web of subsidiaries and holding companies. At the top of the pyramid, all lines of ownership converged on a single entity. Its name displayed in bold, unforgiving letters: Ethelred Holdings. "Your company," Elara stated, her voice cutting through his shock, "has been a wholly owned subsidiary of my organization since the day we met. Your successes were engineered. Your failures were mitigated. You were not a titan of industry, Julian. You were a pet project." The words struck him with the force of a physical assault. His ambition, his intelligence, his ruthless drive, he had believed these were the engines of his success. To learn they were just components in a machine someone else had built and controlled was a violation more profound than any financial loss. "Why?" he choked out, the single word a vessel for all his shattered pride. "Why marry me? Why live like that?" Silas Vance believed that to truly command the world, one must first understand it. Not from a boardroom, but from the ground. He designed a series of life immersions. For me to understand philanthropy, I spent a year working in a soup kitchen in the Rust Belt. To understand technology, I worked as a low-level coder in Silicon Valley. And to understand the specific brand of corrosive, empty ambition that drives so much of the modern economy. She paused, her eyes finally locking onto his. "He chose you." Julian felt sick. His entire life, his identity, was a lie. He wasn't a self-made man. He was a case study, a lab rat in a gilded cage. "You were the perfect specimen," Elara continued, her voice clinical. "Predictably arrogant, blinded by status, and utterly incurious about anything that did not directly serve your own advancement. You never once asked about my past. You never wondered why I had no family, no old friends. You saw a quiet, malleable woman who could serve as a decorative, low-maintenance accessory to your life. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see." He looked up at Elara, a desperate, wild hope flickering within him. "Elara, please, I'm sorry. I was angry. I was stupid. I love you. I didn't know. I can change. We can make this work, for real this time. You and me, together. Think of the power we could have." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Elara's face. It was not anger. It was not pity. It was a profound, weary disappointment. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said softly. "You think this is about power. I am power, Julian. What I needed from you was a lesson in humanity. And the lesson I learned is that men like you, when given everything, feel nothing but the desire for more. When faced with something you cannot control, you seek to destroy it." She gestured to her wine-stained dress. "This was not an act of anger, it was an act of weakness. And the experiment is now complete." Her gaze shifted past him to the young waitress, Chloe, who was hovering nervously by the service station, unsure if she should leave or stay. "Chloe," Elara called out. The young woman jumped, startled. "Yes, ma'am?" "You were the only person in this room who offered me simple kindness," Elara said. "You saw a person in distress, and your first instinct was to help, not to judge or to fear." "Arthur?" Arthur tapped his tablet. "Chloe Martinez, student at City College, studying architectural engineering. Double shifts here to pay for tuition and her mother's medical care." Elara looked at the stunned waitress. "Your tuition and your mother's medical bills have been paid in full, indefinitely. When you graduate, there will be an internship waiting for you at the lead design firm for the Sterling Tower project. A project which, as of tonight, I will be personally overseeing." Chloe's eyes filled with tears. She could only stammer a thank you, her voice thick with emotion. Elara's point was made with surgical precision. A small act of kindness was rewarded beyond measure. A monumental act of cruelty was punished with utter annihilation. Julian finally understood. This wasn't a divorce, it was a balancing of the scales. Arthur stepped forward again. He produced a slim leather portfolio and opened it on the table. Inside was a single document. "The divorce papers," Arthur said. "They were drafted and signed by Madame Vance on the day before your wedding. All that is required is your signature." Julian stared at the simple, brutal document. It stated he would walk away with nothing but the personal effects he owned prior to the wedding. His cars, his penthouse, his art collection, his company. They were all assets of Ethelred, merely loaned to him for the duration of the experiment. He picked up the pen Arthur offered. The weight of it felt immense, a tool to sign his own oblivion. His signature was a pathetic scrawl. He was no longer Julian Croft, the Titan. He was just a man in a suit that technically no longer belonged to him. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice a hollow whisper. "Not quite," Elara said. She walked to the table where Alistair Finch's abandoned wineglass still sat. She picked it up, not his own, but Finch's. The investor, who had been frozen by the door, flinched. "Mr. Finch," Elara said, her voice turning to ice, "you were also part of this evening's assessment. You knew of Julian's reputation for cruelty. You witnessed his behavior. And you did nothing. You are a collaborator of the highest order, the kind who mistakes silence for neutrality." Finch began to sweat profusely. "Madam Vance, I assure you, you will be assimilated," Elara cut him off. "Ethelred now holds a controlling interest in Finch Consolidated. Your board has been dissolved. Your C-suite has been fired. You will remain as a transitional figurehead with no authority and no salary until we have finished restructuring your company into something useful. You will watch as we dismantle your life's work and rebuild it into something that serves a purpose beyond your own greed. Consider it your penance." Finch's face went slack, the blood draining from it. He had come for a deal and had walked into his own execution. He stumbled out of the restaurant, a broken man. Elara then turned her attention back to Julian, her eyes holding his. "You asked why. Why live like that? Because I had to be certain. Silas left me with a final directive. Find a partner worthy of sharing the weight of Ethelred. Someone with vision, with strength, but with a core of decency. He believed such a person could be found anywhere, even hidden beneath a veneer of ambition." She let out a soft, humorless breath. "For 3 years, I gave you every opportunity to reveal that decency. I left ethical dilemmas on your desk disguised as business problems. I presented you with charitable opportunities you dismissed as trivial. I waited for one single moment of genuine curiosity, of selfless kindness. One moment where you saw a person instead of an asset." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried the force of a storm. "Tonight was the final test. I gave you an opening to be a partner, to listen, to trust. Instead, you chose to see a threat. You chose to humiliate. You chose to dominate." She placed the wine glass on the table in front of him. "This is all you have left of the world you thought you knew. I am leaving you with nothing but the empty symbols you valued so highly. See what they are worth to you tomorrow morning when you have no home, no company, and no name." With that, she turned. Arthur held open the door, and Elara Vance walked out of the restaurant and out of his life. She didn't look back. A moment later, a sleek, utterly anonymous black sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the city's stream of lights. Julian was left alone in the vast, empty dining room. The silence was a pressure against his eardrums. He had been sleeping next to the sun and had only ever complained about the heat. Slowly he reached for the wine glass. He raised it, seeing a distorted reflection of a hollow man, a fool who had thrown away a universe because he was annoyed by a star. The wine had no taste, the glass had no value. They were just things. And he was just nothing. He sat there as the minutes turned to an hour, then 2. The paralysis of his shock began to recede, replaced by a frantic, buzzing denial. He pulled out his phone to call his lawyer, Marcus. The screen showed 5 bars of signal, a small, cruel lie. He dialed the number. It rang once, then a click. A recorded voice, sterile and digital, spoke. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service." He tried the restaurant's landline. It was dead. The isolation was already absolute, a digital wall erected around him. Eventually, a security guard wearing a uniform with the subtle Ethelred raven embroidered on the collar entered. He didn't look at Julian with pity or contempt, but with the same disinterest one might show a piece of furniture. "Sir," the guard said, his voice polite but firm, "you have to leave. The property is being repurposed." Julian walked out onto the street. The pre-dawn air was crisp and cool. The city he thought he owned felt alien, its lights blinking with a language he no longer understood. He walked to the nearest ATM, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm of hope and dread. He slid his platinum card into the slot. "Card invalid. Please contact your financial institution." He tried another. The same. He was severed. He began the long walk to his penthouse, a journey of miles that felt like a descent through the circles of his own private hell. When he finally arrived, the sky bruised with the first light of dawn, the doorman, a man named George, whose wife was suffering from a long illness, a detail Julian had never known or cared to know, stood with his arms crossed, flanked by two impassive men in grey suits. "I'm sorry, Mr. Croft," George said, and for the first time ever he used Julian's name without a hint of deference. There was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "We have instructions. You are not permitted entry." "This is my home," Julian snarled, a pathetic echo of his former authority. One of the grey-suited men stepped forward. "The property belongs to a holding company under the Ethelred umbrella, as does the suit you are wearing. Your access has been revoked." The man held up a small cardboard box. "Madame Vance instructed us to return your personal effects." Inside were the scuffed leather shoes he had owned before meeting Alara and a single cheap suit from a forgotten corner of his closet. The humiliation was so profound it was almost elegant. The days that followed were a free-fall. He found a payphone and called a hedge fund manager he'd golfed with just last week. "Julian, I heard what happened," the man said, his voice a nervous whisper. "Listen, I can't be seen talking to you. You understand?" The line went dead. The second call, to a man whose company Julian had saved from bankruptcy, was worse. The man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You messed with the Raven, you idiot. You're radioactive. Don't call this number again." He sold his Patek Philippe watch, a symbol of his arrival, for a fraction of its worth to a jeweler who smirked as he counted out the crumpled bills. Within a month, Julian Croft was a resident of the St. Jude's municipal shelter. The stench of bleach, boiled cabbage, and quiet despair clung to him, a perfume of his new station. In the dining hall, he tried to assert his old dominance, shoving a frail older man aside to get the last piece of bread. "That's mine," he'd growled, the words feeling foreign and weak in his own mouth. The woman who cleaned the floors, Maria, saw the commotion. She didn't scold him. Instead, she walked over and quietly placed her own untouched roll on Julian's tray. "You need it more," she said, her eyes holding not judgment, but a deep, weary pity that was more scalding than any insult. He was no longer a predator. He was an object of charity, a thing to be pitied by the very people he considered less than human. His arrogance was a tough weed, but it could not grow in the barren soil of his new reality. One rainy afternoon, huddled in the public library for warmth, he saw Arthur. The man sat at a terminal, typing with silent purpose. Julian, gaunt and desperate, his cheap suit hanging off his frame, approached him like a supplicant approaching an altar. "Arthur?" Arthur looked up, his expression as neutral as a blank screen. He didn't seem surprised to see him. "Mr. Croft." "You have to tell her," Julian pleaded, his voice a hoarse whisper that was lost in the library's hush. "Tell her I understand now. It was a test. I failed. But I've learned my lesson. I'll do anything. I can be useful to her." "Useful?" Arthur interrupted, his voice edged with a clinical coldness that was sharper than any shouted insult. "Your only use was as a metric, Mr. Croft, a baseline for a specific type of moral bankruptcy. You were the control group." He turned his screen slightly. It was filled with charts and reports, a dissection of Julian's entire life. "The experiment is over. The data has been compiled." Arthur pointed to a specific file. "Do you remember the Alara Croft Foundation? Last year, it presented you with two funding proposals. One was for a high-profile gala at the Museum of Modern Art, which you approved, noting its networking potential. The other was a grant to fund a mobile medical clinic for the city's homeless. You denied it. Your handwritten note reads, 'A poor return on social and financial investment.'" Julian's stomach churned. He remembered the memo, the dismissive flick of his pen. "Madame Vance funded the clinic personally, of course," Arthur continued, his eyes unblinking. "It's been in operation for 6 months. The woman who cleans your shelter, Maria, her young son's life was saved by that clinic last month when he had a severe asthma attack. Your decision had consequences, Mr. Croft. Your failures were not abstract, they had names and faces. He swiped the screen, bringing up another file. Or this, an analyst in your firm, David Chen. He made a calculation error that cost the company $80,000. Your directive was immediate termination. We intervened. We retrained him. Last quarter, an algorithm he developed saved the Sterling project from a $17 million structural flaw. You saw a mistake. Madame Vance saw potential that needed nurturing. The final piece of Julian's shattered ego turned to dust. His cruelty hadn't just been a character flaw, it had been an active, destructive force in a world he never bothered to see. However, Arthur said, his expression unchanging as he closed the file, Madame Vance believes in the value of all data points, even the null hypothesis. She believes in closing all loops, no matter how insignificant. She left one final thing for you. He slid a single crisp envelope across the table. It landed with a soft, final thud. Julian's hands trembled as he opened it. It was an invitation, thick and embossed, to the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Sterling Tower. In the bottom corner, in elegant handwritten script that he now recognized as Ilara's, were two words: +1. A delirious, insane hope surged through him. An olive branch, a final test of his newfound humility. He spent his last dollars getting his one remaining suit cleaned and pressed. He showed up at the event, a ghost at the feast, his heart pounding with a pathetic, desperate rhythm. The site was buzzing with an energy he'd never seen. It wasn't the cold corporate affair he would have orchestrated. There were community leaders, artists, students. He saw a former colleague, a man who had once fawned over his every word, who now looked straight through him as if he were a pane of glass. At the edge of the hospitality tent, handing out brochures with a dead look in his eyes, was Alistair Finch. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. "Finch," Julian croaked, "look at us." Finch didn't turn, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "There is no us, Croft," he said, his voice a monotone of utter defeat. "You were the disease. I was just a symptom. Now leave me to my penance." Julian stood at the back, invisible in the crowd, and watched Chloe Martinez take the stage. She was no longer a nervous waitress, but a poised, passionate architect, her face alight with purpose. Julian Croft's vision for this site was a monument to commerce, she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. Ours is a monument to community. It will house a free technical college, a public rooftop garden, and 300 units of subsidized housing for the families who make this city run. It will be a tower that looks down on the city, not with dominance, but with embrace. As the crowd erupted in applause, Julian's gaze found Ilara. She stood at the edge of the stage, watching Chloe with a smile of genuine pride. Then, for a breathtaking second, her eyes scanned the crowd and passed directly over him, landing on someone standing beside him. She gave a subtle, warm nod. Julian turned. It was Maria, the cleaner from the shelter, dressed in a simple but neat dress, her eyes shining with a light he couldn't comprehend. "She invited me too," Maria whispered to him, her voice filled with awe. She held up an identical invitation. She said people like us are the foundation, that our voices matter. She then looked at Julian's haggard face, at the desperation in his eyes, and in an act of kindness so pure it was like a physical blow, she offered him her small paper cup of water. "You look like you could use this." And then Julian understood. The invitation wasn't for him. The +1 wasn't for him to bring a guest. It was a label. He was the +1. An addendum, a footnote to the real guests, the foundational people like Maria. He was a living exhibit of the failure she had discarded, brought here to observe the final result of the experiment. He looked back at Ilara. She was talking now to an old man in a wheelchair, a community activist he recognized and had once dismissed as a nuisance. Her focus was absolute. She never glanced his way again. That single passing gaze hadn't been cold acknowledgement. It had been something far worse, complete non-recognition. He was a crack in the pavement, a face in the crowd, a piece of static. He understood the final, most brutal truth. He was not her enemy. He was not her failed husband. He was not even a memory. He was an irrelevant, discarded data point. His punishment wasn't poverty or obscurity. It was the simple, absolute fact that in the world Ilara Vance was building, a world of purpose, kindness, and consequence, he had never mattered at all. The golden shovels broke the earth. They were not just starting a new building, they were burying a dead idea, the one he had embodied. He turned and walked away, pushed and buffeted by the cheerful, departing crowd. A news reporter was doing a live broadcast near the exit, and Ilara's face was on the monitor beside her. Her voice, calm and clear, cut through the noise. "It's not about tearing down the old systems," she was saying. "It's about building a foundation so strong, so equitable, that the hollow structures simply collapse on their own." He stumbled away, the words echoing in his hollow chest. He walked for hours until his feet were numb. He passed his old office, where workmen were taking down the bronze letters of the Croft Development Group sign. He watched the C come down, then the R, each one a small death. Above them, a massive digital billboard flickered to life, showing Ilara's face, announcing the Ethelred Urban Renewal Fund. The city was being rewritten over his erasure. His path, without conscious thought, led him back past the St. Jude's shelter. Through the smudged window, he could see Maria sitting with her son, helping him with his homework, her face illuminated by the warm, cheap light. The boy was playing with a small, intricate model of a skyscraper. A gift, Julian knew with sickening certainty, from the foundation he had scorned. He saw the life his cruelty had nearly extinguished, a life now flourishing in a world he was no longer a part of. He was an outsider, looking in at the humanity he had disdained. His hand went into the pocket of his threadbare suit and closed around a small, smooth stone he'd forgotten was there. Ilara had given it to him a long time ago, on a walk along the coast. "It reminds me that even the hardest things can be made smooth with time and pressure," she'd said. He'd thought it was just a sentimental trinket. Now he knew it had been a prophecy. He pulled his hand from his pocket and let the stone drop. It hit the pavement with a tiny, barely audible click, a sound lost in the noise of the city. He was not a ghost, for a ghost is a memory. He was something less, a footnote in a report that would never be read, filed away in a cabinet in a room he would never see. The city buzzed around him, a city being reborn by the woman he thought he owned, and he was just a man walking toward nowhere, having finally achieved the complete and total invisibility he had once demanded of her.